Words from Daddy's Mouth by Lily Burgess. Book 4, The Brandings Game. Remember how I had to repeat Year 6 because I broke both my arms? Asked Dad. Jazz, Stephanie and Avie all nodded. Jazz and Stephanie because they recalled the story, and Avie because her sisters were nodding.
Dad continued. After I broke my right arm, and the plaster cast had been on for 2 months, it was removed with the biggest pair of scissors I had ever seen.
How big? Interrupted Avie. Almost as big as you, Avie, said Dad. Avie giggled. Is that true, Matthew? Mum asked. Dad ignored the question and moved on with his story. As soon as the cast was off, I enjoyed getting back into all of the sports and games that I loved playing, like soccer, cricket and running. However, at school I mostly played handball, British Bulldogs 1, 2, 3 and brandings. What is British Bulldogs 1, 2, 3, Dad? Asked Stephanie. That was a game where we had our entire class line up on one end of the soccer field, and one person would be nominated to stand in the middle of the field. When the person in the middle called out, "Go British Bulldogs!" the whole class tried to run to the other end of the ground. The person in the middle would try to tackle people onto the ground and then hold them down and yell out, "British Bulldogs, 1, 2, 3!" Anybody captured then stood in the middle with the original person so that they could tackle people as well. This process kept going over and over again until eventually there was only one person left trying to run across the field. That person would win if they could get across the field without being caught and tackled by any of the people standing in the middle. "Wow," said Jazz. "That sounds really dangerous," Stephanie said. "Yes, really dangerous," said Avie, her eyes wide with concern. "It was very dangerous," whispered Dad, "but I was so good at it that I never got hurt." Mum rolled her eyes. "Matthew, is this story appropriate?" "Mum, you were interrupting the story," said Stephanie. "Did you break your left arm while you were playing British Bulldogs 1, 2, 3? Jazz asked. "No, Jazz," said Dad. "I broke my left arm while playing brandings." "What's bandings, Dad?" asked Avie. Dad laughed. "It was called brandings, Avie, not bandings. Brandings involved everyone in the class playing a game like hide and seek, but with a tennis ball. When the person with the tennis ball spotted somebody else who was playing the game, then they would throw the tennis ball as hard as they could to try to hit or brand the other person. If they hit the other person, then that person was up, which meant they had to run around with the tennis ball and find somebody else to throw it at. You had to be a fast runner, an accurate shot, and be able to hide well to be good at brandings. And luckily, I was excellent at all these things." Mum coughed and asked, "Are you sure about this, Matthew?" "Then why did you break your left arm, Dad?" asked Stephanie. "Yes, Matthew," Mum said. "I was excellent at brandings, as I said. It was just that I was very bad at jumping over high walls." "What do you mean?" Jazz asked. "I will explain more in a moment," Dad continued. "Firstly, do you know why the game was called brandings?" All 3 girls put their hands high up into the air and yelled, "I know!" "Okay then, Avie, why do you think the game was called brandings?" Dad said, smiling at Avie. "'Cause it was not called bandings." Everyone laughed. Jazz then jumped in. "Because that is the name you made up for it, Dad." Dad grinned. That's a good reason, Jazz, but not the answer. I know, interrupted Stephanie. The reason it was called brandings was because if you were hit by a tennis ball hard enough, it left a big red mark on you. That's right, Stephanie, and I can confirm those brands hurt a lot. Come on, Dad. Tell us what happened on the day you broke your arm, Stephanie moaned impatiently. Well, said Dad, we were playing brandings during little lunch. You call it first break nowadays. And it was almost time for the bell to ring to go back to class. As I came around one of the classroom buildings, I saw someone with the tennis ball, and guess who it was? Mummy? Asked Avie with a big grin. No, Avie, Mummy and Daddy had not met yet. The person I saw was the boy who owned the bicycle known as the Terrible Red Racer. Jeremy Tobin! Yelled Jazz and Stephanie in unison. Yes, Jeremy Tobin was up. I knew that Jeremy was good at brandings, but not as good as me, said Dad, puffing up his chest. So I decided I would need to run as fast as I could while zigzagging. If Jeremy threw the ball at me, I thought I should be able to dodge it. So I decided to run around the side of the classroom and then into a courtyard area. The courtyard had a high wall built all the way around it. There were also some seats next to the far end of the wall. How big was the wall? Asked Jazz. Dad stood up and held his arm about halfway up his body. About as tall as you, Jazz, about 1.2 metres. How come? Asked Avie. Everyone laughed at Avie's favourite saying. That is not actually very high, said Stephanie. It was very high when you consider what I decided to do next, Dad said. What did you decide to do? Asked Jazz. Dad paused, took a big breath, and sounding just like a horse racing announcer, he said, I raced into the courtyard, then realised that Jeremy Tobin was catching up to me and that I wouldn't be able to get out of the courtyard by going back from where I had come. I decided I would jump up onto one of the chairs, then onto the top of the wall, then down onto the concrete on the other side and keep running really fast. Dad took another deep breath. That does not sound dangerous to me, said Stephanie. It probably wasn't too dangerous if I had actually done what I planned to do. But guess what I did instead? Asked Dad, remembering what had happened. The girls were silent while Dad gathered his thoughts. Eventually Mum said, Matthew, could you please get back on track with the story? Oh, sorry, said Dad. Instead of jumping off the wall, I decided to do a dive roll. What's a dive roll? Asked Jazz. A dive roll, said Dad, as he stood up to demonstrate, is something like this. Dad suddenly jumped onto one side of the bed and then rolled over and over and over before falling off the other side with a loud thud and a grunt. You okay, Dada? Asked Avie as the other girls started to giggle. No, groaned Dad. I bumped my head. Mum looked very concerned, but once she realised Dad was okay, she said, Matthew, be more careful, please. Dad slowly got up, rubbing his head, and continued the story. So I jumped onto the concrete wall and started to do a dive roll while letting myself fall towards the ground. Jeremy had not thrown the ball at me yet, so about halfway during my fall, I realised I would need to push myself off the ground as fast as possible, so I could start running again to make sure I was not branded. To do this manoeuvre, I put my left arm straight out like this. Dad again stood up and demonstrated by putting his arm out. Is anyone going to get injured in this demonstration, Matthew? Laughed Mum. Ignoring the comment, Dad continued. As I put my arm out, time seemed to slow down. I remember thinking, Matthew, this was how you had your right arm when you were falling from the terrible red racer. Even though I knew I should move my left arm or I would break it, I couldn't. Before I had a chance to take another breath, I heard... Dad paused, then clapped his hands together really loudly and shouted, Snap! Avie jumped with fright and ran to Mum for a hug while Stephanie and Jazz rolled about laughing. Dad continued the story. I knew as soon as I saw the bone popping up at right angles out of my left arm that I had broken it. Fortunately, and most importantly, even though I had broken my arm, Jeremy Tobin had missed branding me, because he had aimed at the spot where I would have been if I had managed to get up and start running again. Instead, I lay like a dying bug on the ground, trying to get enough strength to pick up my left arm that had become totally numb and felt as heavy as 1,000,000,000 kilograms. Dad lay down, reenacting a dying bug. Mum and the girls laughed, and Mum said, Matthew, really, is that necessary? It helps the girls better visualize the scene, said Dad, and continued with his story. I didn't want to cry, so I clenched my teeth like this. Dad pulled a face that made him look like he was smiling. As Jeremy ran past me to get the tennis ball, he said, Hey, great move, Burjo. I completely missed you. I said, Yeah, except I broke my arm doing it. He laughed, said, Sure, and ran off. Can you believe it? How come? Avie asked again, then covered her mouth and giggled. How come? Repeated Dad. I'm not sure, Avie, but guess what I decided to do? What? Asked Stephanie. Dad paused and started daydreaming again. Seeing how excited the girls were, Mum tried to encourage Dad and said, Come on, please finish the story, Matthew. Dad woke up from his daydream with a jump. Did you know that Gran was a primary school teacher? Yes, said Jazz. She now helps me with my reading. When I was your age, she was a relief teacher. Relief teachers fill in for other teachers when they are away, which means that the relief teacher could be working at any one of dozens of different schools throughout a town on any particular day. We know that, Dad. We have relief teachers as well, you know, said Stephanie. Okay, but guess where Gran was being a relief teacher on this particular day? Your school? Asked Jazz with a big grin. Yes, at my school. Can you believe it? I decided to go to the teacher's staff room and find my mum, your Gran. The problem was that I had to walk through 2 sets of heavy doors. Because I was using my right arm to hold up my left arm, I had to squeeze the top of my right arm into the handle of each door and use my body weight to pull the door back. Then I used my leg to keep it open as I rushed through the door. It was very, very difficult to open each door. It took me a long time to get to the staff room. When I got there, I asked one of the teachers near the door to see if Mrs. Burgess was available, and after a period of time, Gran came out to see me. She did not look happy. I said, Mum, I've broken my arm. Then guess what your Gran said? That you were a naughty girl? Asked Avie seriously, forgetting that Dad had been a boy at the time. No, not quite, laughed Dad. What Gran said was, That's nice, darling. Guess what she did then? She closed the door and walked back into the staff room. Can you believe it? Dad said. Even worse, the door that Gran closed on me automatically locked, so I had to kick the door with my foot to try to get someone to open it. It took a long time before another teacher came out. Instead of asking to see my mum, I barged into the staff room and searched for her. I found her near the back of the room talking and laughing with some other teachers. This time I stood right in front of Gran and said, "Mum, I have really broken my arm. Look." I showed her the bone almost popping out of my skin. Guess what Gran said this time? Stephanie and Jazz were totally silent as Avie squeezed Mum tightly. This time she screamed, "Oh my goodness, Matthew, you have broken your arm!" "Oh my goodness is Gran's favourite saying," laughed Jazz. "Yes, it is." Gran then got me help straight away and organised Gramps to drive me to the hospital so my arm could get fixed. Luckily, unlike with my right arm, everything went pretty well at the hospital. "You mean you didn't get to go in an ambulance, Dad?" asked Stephanie. "That's right, Stephanie. There were no ambulances needed this time. The worst thing that happened this time was that while I was waiting for Dad to pick me up, I was sitting at the front of the classroom. Gran said, 'Sorry for not believing you. The way you were clenching your teeth, it looks like a big smile, and that you were playing a joke.'" "What was bad about that?" asked Jazz. "There was nothing bad about what Gran said. It was what she did." Dad then moved in closer and whispered, "She gave me a big, squishy cuddle and a sloppy kiss in front of my whole class." "Ew!" Stephanie, Jazz and Avie screamed as they fell over laughing.